Today's the 5th of June, 2015, and I'm here with Hal Clark in Guyman, Oklahoma. So Hal, can you tell me when and where you were born?
In 1932 in Bartlesville, Oklahoma.
Okay, so could you tell me a little bit about the history of your family and how they got to Bartlesville?
Okay, my mother and father both graduated at OU, and Dad started his career in Bartlesville with city service, and was continued with them his whole lifetime, and retired as chief geologist from Bartlesville, from city service, before they moved to Tulsa. And that gave me a lot of interest in outdoors and geology and just nature and the natural things that we are involved with. Both of my parents were children of early day ranchers out here in the Panhandle. Okay. My dad's father came over from England as a very young man, a middle son. His widowed mother stayed in England, and the youngest, his younger brother, Frank, stayed there with her. His older brother, William, had already come over to the United States, and Dad's father was named Henry, came to Ellis Island, and changed his name to Harry. And it was Harry Clark. Mm-hmm. So then he ended up on a cattle boat to Galveston and decided to be a cowboy. So then they took cattle to southeast New Mexico, to the ranching area down there, and had a lot of interesting stories that about when Billy the Kid was there and the Lincoln County Wars and all that sort of stuff. He came north with a cattle herd to Dodge City and liked the area here around Guyman, and then went ahead and started working for ranches here, and then bought a place north of Guyman, a small ranch. Started running his own cattle there. Then a local group, and I have not found much history of this except some pictures we have, that they formed a gold mining co-op, and about 24 local ranchers put money into the co-op. He sold the ranch and the cattle, put half the money into the co-op, and left the other half with my grandmother. And they all went to caught a train at Liberal. The train wasn't through Guyman yet. They caught a train out of Liberal, and they have a picture. My father was born in 1899, and so it was probably spring of 1900, I mean, when they went to Alaska. Wow. I have a picture of Dad with my granddad holding his arms on the train station there as they were leaving. It was a cooperative, so that if anybody struck gold up there in the Nome area, then they would all share proportionally. Unfortunately, about all he came back with was a Thai gold nugget on a Thai stick pin.
But he probably had some really good stories.
A lot of good stories, but anyway, they came back later. So Dad was raised here in Guyman. He was born on the ranch just north of town. Then grew up in Guyman, graduated from school here. Went to OU to be an electrical engineer. Then he was excited about, he took some electives courses at OU, and geology was one of them, and he had a hard time with the relationship, being a strong Christian background, of the biblical reference to the creation of the earth and the geological creation as geologic times. But he realized there had to be a divine creator that put it all together. It was, the Bible explains it so we all understand it, but he realized that it still fit the geologic times, that it fascinated him then to know more about it. So that's why he became a geologist. Mother was raised in Cimarron County on the ranch we still have on the Cimarron River. Her father was born in San Rafael, California, and left at an early age. He was on the Bay Area there, and his father was went down at sea with the SS London, a steamer bringing people from England around South America to the West Coast. And a storm in the Bay of Biscay between France and Spain apparently sunk the ship, and so
Wow.
were lost at sea. So after that happened, my mother's father, for some reason, left home and came inland. Ended up in the Denver area as a very, very young man. Then had a lot of difficult times. Came out on the plains. Actually ended up with a family around Salina, east of Salina, Kansas, and they kind of became his immediate family. And a lot of early Indian stories that I'll have to tell at another time probably. But he started trading horses and traveling a lot. And back then, you just get on your horse and go horseback like we get in the car and travel now. So he came to the Cimarron River Valley in 1877 and worked for a cattle company there on the river. And in, I think, 1880 or 81, he was bought out by the Muscatine Cattle Company, which was an English syndicate, which a lot of those syndicates were operators on the plains at that time, the open range. A lot of large cattle companies ran lots of cattle. The Muscatine then branded the ZH brand. I don't know how that came about, but so that was his beginning with the Muscatine and the ZH, still there on the river. The headquarters is just probably a mile and a half, 2 miles from where our ranch is. In early 86, January, there was a terribly bad blizzard that just wiped out cattle all over the plains. It was very severe. The early spring roundup, I know they had, I have pictures of the riders when they left May the 1st. I've got a record book that showed the name of the riders together. All the ranches went together and they just scattered out in a huge circle roundup to bring cattle back and sort out the brands. There was 39 riders and 9 cooks. So there was 9 different camps of riders just from the ZH, from the Muscatine,
Wow.
besides all the other ranches. It's very interesting what they went through.
Yeah.
When they came back and gathered all the cattle they could and sold them, whatever the remnant of the herd was left in the hills, my grandfather purchased. And that's how he purchased the ZH brand, which we still use today. And we've kept it registered the whole time.
Wow.
So he picked out the area that he liked, right there close to the ZH headquarters and the canyons on the north side of the river. And so that's where he started ranching then in 1886. Then, of course, in 89, then he started putting together some land by homesteads. And many of the early cowboys out there would homestead on the live water. It's quite checkerboarded, but that was the way he was able to start buying these different homesteads. I mean, the early ranchers would probably do that as a little bit of cash money after they homesteaded to go ahead and help put together what they wanted to do. So then in 1906, the Enabling Act, the state of Oklahoma, in order to have school land that had already been settled because of the land run in 1889, that there was not the designated school land like other western states provided for the school systems. So the Enabling Act in 1906, the state dedicated all the land that was not homesteaded in Cimarron County on a particular grid. They just marked it off on the northwest side of the county that's in lieu of lands that was close to homesteading. So that forced all the ranchers out there in that area then they had their deeded land where the live water is, then to go ahead and lease school land to have the ranches.
So how long has
it's still been that way, and it's a very difficult situation, especially in the last number of years where they have gone to competitive bidding for that land. It's been very difficult for the families that have been there for a long time to keep the ranches together.
Right. And how long has your family been leasing that school land?
And we've been leasing it?
Yeah. Has your family leased it from the
ever
beginning?
Since 1906.
Okay. All right. So could you tell me how your father and mother met? Because it sounded like they came from opposite ends of the state.
That's interesting. Dad graduated high school here at Guyman. Mother went to PAI at Goodwill, Panhandle Agricultural Institute. She and her sister. My grandfather bought a 2-story house down there for the family to live in to go to college.
Mm-hmm.
They had an older brother. He went 1 or 2 years and went back to the ranch. And that was her brother Harry. The unusual part of the family is that mother's father was Robert Harry Clark, and dad's father was Harry Clark. So I ended up having 2 uncles named Robert Harry Clark, one on each side. The families, I think my grandfathers were pretty well acquainted, but the families had never been together.
Mm-hmm.
So mother and dad didn't actually meet until they were both in Norman.
Wow.
And mother always laughed. She said that dad took advantage of that because the house mom apparently thought they were related, so she gave dad extra visiting privileges. But they dated quite a bit there at OU and became engaged. They both graduated. Mother went back to Cimarron County and taught school for a year. And dad went to, was hired by the company and went to Kentucky and did plain table geology work. Since he was a horseman, it was natural for him to do, in that rough country, do plain table geology. And then when they transferred him, he worked for Tidewater Oil Company, which was bought out by City Service. And so then that moved him to Bartlesville, and mother and dad went ahead and were married then and began his career in Bartlesville.
Okay, so you grew up in Bartlesville.
Well, the first 4 years, during the 30s, Dad, I guess I should say, in the 20s, late 20s, he had a department under him. There were 33 in his department that he was head of. And when the Depression hit in '29, he got the first pink slip to get rid of 10%, to get rid of 3 people. It was a very difficult time for my father to go through that. 32 people under him, 33 people in his geological department. Then when the pink slips quit coming in, he said after a while everybody said, "Okay, Frank, I know, we'll go." You know, and he said very talented young people that they had to let go. He said it was terrible. All they could do was maybe sack groceries or something. He said a lot of talent, but because the economic times were difficult. When the pink slips quit coming, there was 3 people left out of 33.
Wow.
Himself, a young geologist, and a secretary. And it caused a lot of emotional problems for him. Nervous stomach.
Sure.
Was really what happened. So in 1935, they transferred him to West Texas. City Service had an office in San Angelo. So we were there 2 years in San Angelo before they built a company camp at Odessa, Texas, where the Permian Basin is, where all the oil was being found at that time. To explain how tough things were, City Service had their offices in San Angelo, and they also had a filling station there. So Dad went to a junkyard and got another fuel tank and put in the trunk of his field car so he could fill up with City Service fuel in San Angelo to go out to West Texas and back. So that shows the desperation that the companies were going through at that time. But then he was transferred to Odessa when the company camp was built there. It was of course, Odessa was becoming quite a boom town with the early days in oil exploration. Dad was doing much better, but he was doing what he enjoyed. So my brother, I had an older brother, named Robert Harry. And so he was already in school, and I began school in Odessa.
Mm-hmm.
We went through the 6th grade before we moved again. So Odessa was my early growing up time.
Mm-hmm.
And Bob was 6 years older, but because Dad had to do a lot of field geology, many times the geologist then would sleep at the rig. He would carry a cot in the back of the car,
Mm-hmm.
and he would know the different depths. He would maybe be asleep on his cot, and he could tell the sound of the drill bit changing when they changed formations. So he'd wake up and go get samples. Of course,
Wow.
the crew was always holding samples for him, but that way he could follow the formations as they were getting close to what he wanted
Mm-hmm.
to analyze. A lot of good oil production came in West Texas and the Permian Basin. It's still a very productive oil region.
Mm-hmm.
But since he was away from home a lot working, well, Bob really kind of helped raise me. And I remember him telling his friends that you play with me, you play with Hal too. So I got to go along with my bicycle to follow them wherever we both had paper routes.
Uh-huh.
So we both delivered papers in Odessa. But I remember so many times the things that I got to do that Bob would include me.
What kinds of
It was
things did
great.
you do for fun as a kid?
I'm sorry?
What did you do for fun as a kid?
For fun?
Uh-huh.
We were on the edge of town at the camp there, and so we did a lot of hiking after the paper routes. We'd
Uh-huh.
hike out in a lot of mesquite country down there, but we'd hike quite a ways. And I don't know. We did have a swimming pool there at the camp. One of the engineers there got an old oil storage tank,
Uh-huh.
and put dirt around it and made a swimming pool with a diving board and everything. And that was fun. We swam a lot. And then there was wasn't a windmill. I remember a tower there by it, a derrick like a big windmill.
Mm-hmm.
And the sparrows were real bad. And I remember my brother and I'd climb up there at night. We put flashlights on our BB guns. We sat there and tried to bomb the sparrows at night because they'd come in to rest in that tower. Bob took auto mechanics there before he graduated in '43,
Mm-hmm.
and taught me to drive. Dad bought an old Chevrolet 10.5 truck, and gosh, I wasn't 9 or 10 probably when I learned to drive.
Mm-hmm.
And we did a lot of things together.
Mm-hmm.
Well, riding bicycles, I remember when he was trying to help me learn how to ride a bicycle, and he would push me as fast as he could till I could get fast enough to get the gyroscopic effect of balance, you know.
Yeah.
And yeah, it was a lot of fun years. In 1941, Mother and Dad had wanted a third child, and Mother had miscarried once, I understand, and so they adopted a 6 weeks old baby girl. I remember going to San Angelo to get her. No, I'm sorry, Fort Worth. Went to Fort Worth, and I guess a little background on that. I never forget one time, Mother had some health problems at that time, was kind of weak, but I know the adoption age, she was very concerned about 39 and 40-year-old parents adopting a child. And I'm 9 years older than Beth, so anyway, I never forget one evening after school, Bob said, we've got to go home and help Mother do the laundry. And back when we had the wash tubs, you know,
Mm-hmm.
and the wringer,
Mm-hmm.
the washing machine. So anyway, I was kind of disgusted because I wanted to go play or do something else. Bob said, no, we got to go home and help Mother wash. So when we got to the house and got off our bicycles, I ran up on the porch and I ran in through the door. I remember it very vividly. Threw open the screen door and ran in. My mother was sitting on the sofa talking to a lady. And I just went in and blurted out, well, Mother, we came home and helped you do the laundry. And this lady looked around and looked at us, and Mother introduced us and everything. Well, here's the lady from the adoption center. And she said, my goodness, if those boys help you do the housework, I think this will work. So we got Beth. And she has had an interesting life. We don't get to see each other like I'd like to. She lives south of Topeka, Kansas, and loves to raise horses, being raised as she was with the ranch background. She loves horses.
So, when were you exposed to ranching as a kid?
Well, Dad, Mother's brother Harry
Right.
had the ranch because he was the oldest child, Mother was the youngest of three.
Right.
And being the son, he ended up at the ranch. And the drought and the depression was too much. He sold country he had in Colorado to the government in the 30s.
Okay.
And the government still owns too much of that land. My theory is they should put it back on the market and have it in private ownership. The government doesn't need to own all that land now at this time. We know how to take care of dirt storms and droughts.
Yeah.
So all he had left was the Cimarron's side from the Kansas line, the Colorado line south. And I remember I don't remember what year it was, 36, 37, 38, something like that. We were in Odessa, and I remember Uncle Harry and Alberta came by and visited with the folks. And Dad agreed to take over payments to the Federal Land Bank to keep him from foreclosing on the ranch.
Okay.
So that way it came to Mother then. He put it in Mother's name.
Okay.
And since Dad was salaried, he had been, Mother was very thrifty. She ran the household budget and was very cautious about what she spent money for. Dad was investing a little bit. He loved to invest in stocks, and so he was saving a little money. And he had actually bought some land south of Guyman here because Guyman was his home and he wanted to retire here. So he went ahead and started selling surface on land that he had around Guyman and took over the payments on the ranch to the Federal Land Bank. Gave Uncle Harry 4 years free lease to start building his herd back, try to help him get established again. So Dad worked with him very well, tried to help him, but that's when we became owners of the ranch. So we'd come up here in the summers and started spending a lot of time, and we had all along anyway because that was the home place.
So, do you have any stories from the Dirty 30s from either your recollection of them or from a family member telling you about them?
Of course, Goodwill was the center of the Dust Bowl, and Mother's sister, Merle, she and Aunt Merle graduated at PAI together in 1918. And Dad went into World War I, was uniformed for a short while just before the war was over, so he did have a brief time of military service, which affected his thinking later on. Aunt Merle told a lot of stories about having to hang sheets on the windows and things like that, and about sweeping the dust out. And I know we were at the ranch several times. Probably with the grassland out there did not have the dirt storms they did over here in this area. Because, of course, I don't know, the plowed land north of there, it would be awfully dirty. I remember we've got a big spring up Squaw Canyon. They're on the ranch, and a nice flow of water. And a lot of people used to go out there and have picnics there at the spring. And there's a lot of names carved and the date, initials carved on the walls. But I never will forget oh my gosh, fellow from Campo, I'll think of his name in a minute. He kept telling me, Fred Hathaway, kept telling me that it was dirt storms would be blowing, and he said they were right up in the middle of all that sandy land there at Campo. And he said his father had come in and he said, let's go to Squaw Canyon. So they'd come down there and camp out at this spring until the wind quit blowing. And he said, that's just like music to my ears. That's just like going to somewhere on a big vacation. He said he really enjoyed coming to Skull Canyon and camping out to kind of get out of the wind and the dirt. So there's a lot of good memories about a lot of stories like that people have told me. Being in Odessa, we didn't have the exposure down there. When my brother graduated, when Bob graduated from high school in '43, Dad decided it was time to go to the ranch. So he quit the company, quit a good job, and we moved to the ranch.
So then where did you go to high school?
I went 2 years at Boise City.
Okay. So what was Boise City like when you moved to the ranch?
That was even a transition from Odessa, yeah. And going to town, instead of riding my bicycle to school, I had to, in fact, the old truck, the old 39 Chevy truck, we used it for our school bus for a while. And all the kids it picked up on that route going in, we would get in the back of that truck, and if it was real cold, cover up with a big tarp. It was hard to get vehicles. And Yule Kohler out there that had a machine shop, the Kohler family, had he had the bus route and had a new GMC, red GMC pickup, be it 40. They were made during wartime, so they're very hard to get. But he got one and it built a plywood box on the back of it, and that was our school bus.
How many kids were in that school bus?
Well, it was my cousin and I, and the Kohler kids, 3, and a bunch at what's called Castaneda, little railroad community there, that's there by the Santa Fe Trail side. And there was probably 5 or 6 kids from there, so we had...
Sounds like a lot of kids in the back of a truck.
Yeah, we had... Well, we didn't do that very long because he got that GMC pickup.
So how long was that route? Because you're talking about...
They would come to our house and then pick up the others as they went out because it would be 26 miles from our house to town.
Okay.
So those were long days riding in that bus going into school in Boise City. So it's hard to take part in activities in Boise City in school. A lot of good friends there.
And you were also working on the ranch, I would imagine.
My brother had enrolled at Goodwill to go to college in the fall of '43, and was going to live with my aunt and uncle there, Halsted Hale, called him Hoss Hale. He's the one I'm named for, and that's where I get my nickname Hal. My middle name is Halsted.
Okay.
And so since Dad was Frank, it's all the only name I've gone by.
Okay.
Dad, oil was critical during the war because of defense. It took so much oil. If it hadn't been for crude oil in Texas, it would have been a much more difficult war for the U.S. It is very, very important for national defense efforts. So the oil company was really needing to explore all the oil they could find. And they kept contacting Dad, and finally he went back to work and went to Houston. So during the 8th grade, I guess, middle of the year, the family moved to Houston.
Okay.
My mother, sister, and I. And Dad had already gone down there and started work. So then we were in Houston, I guess 4 years, something like that. I went to junior high and through junior year of high school. Then Dad was transferred again to Fort Worth. City Service had an office there. So I actually finished high school in Fort Worth 1 year.
So what did you do after high school?
What did I do in high school?
What did you do after high school once you finished?
Well, I went to Lubbock to Texas Tech.
Okay, and what did you study there?
Animal science and minor in range management.
Okay.
I considered going to Stillwater, but they really didn't, and probably still don't offer good courses in range management. Texas Tech did. And one thing about Tech, it was a climatic conditions that were close enough to the ranch to be very similar as
Sure.
far as moisture conditions. Ranching in Oklahoma, that's grass is the largest agriculture resource in the state.
Mm-hmm.
But I've been disappointed, and when I worked with the Oklahoma Cattlemen Association years later, Dr. Patricia at OSU, we finally hired 4 range specialists for OSU, and they all came from Texas Tech. And they put 2 in the agronomy department and 2 in animal science.
Uh-huh.
But that was my degree at Tech.
So you knew at that point you wanted to be a rancher?
I beg pardon?
You knew at that point you wanted to be a rancher?
Well,
when you
yes,
went
I was planning to go to the ranch the whole time. I considered being a geologist, and Dad thinking about the cyclical effect of the business, like what we're going through right now, when so many people in the petroleum industry have been let go.
The boom and bust.
It's very difficult. In fact, I guess the time Dad was hired was one of the low times, but he was undoubtedly an outstanding student, and his professor encouraged him to go ahead and take a job.
Mm-hmm.
And actually what he did, he was nearly through a school at OU, and the professor said, "Frank, you better take that job." And so Dad actually graduated, or took his final papers at the University of Kentucky.
Mm-hmm.
But he got his degree from OU, but he took his final work because his professor said, "You better take the job, there's not many out there." So Dad was very concerned about the cyclical nature of the oil business.
Sure.
Didn't encourage me. I enjoyed geology, but he really didn't encourage me. In fact, I guess I have to go back to an earlier time. I was real close to my brother, and we must have talked about it an awful lot after Dad acquired the ranch, and I'm sure that's why he retired early to go to the ranch, because we must have talked about it a lot. I remember one of my teachers, maybe in the 2nd grade, 4th grade, I don't remember just what year, and I remember very well the teacher asking me what I wanted to do when I grow up. I mean, she went around the class asking everybody, and I remember saying I was going to be a cowboy on my brother's ranch. So, you know, that was instilled very early.
Mm-hmm.
That was the
That's
goal
what you wanted to do.
be there.
So then when you graduated from college, what did you do?
Well, unfortunately, back when my brother went to the Marines, he was drafted in '43 and was killed on Iwo Jima.
Wow. Sorry about that. So you lost your best friend.
Yeah, we were close. Psychologically, that had quite an impact on me. When after Pat and I were married, and we're at the ranch, well, it finally realized that he was gone. I had the ranch.
So we were talking about you and Pat at the ranch.
Okay, after I graduated from Tech in spring of '53, now after Fort Worth, my father was transferred back to Bartlesville and became chief geologist there.
Okay.
So while I was at Tech, when I would go back and forth to see them, Dad's youngest brother, Guy, had a ranch by Fairview. So I never forget one Thanksgiving, I had left Lubbock and was going to Bartlesville to see the folks, be with them for Thanksgiving. And I stopped by, Uncle Guy he was 40 years old, a bachelor, and had just gotten married a 39-year-old lady from Fairview. So I wanted to meet my new aunt. And so I stopped there for a little while, and her daughter from Oklahoma City was home for the weekend. And her name was Patricia. So we got acquainted and visited a bit, and then I went on to Bartlesville. But after that, we corresponded some. Since she was the daughter of my aunt, well, we were cousins, so we corresponded, dear cousin. Pat was very active in working in Oklahoma City and very active with a lot of community events, and she's just an outgoing, active person.
Mm-hmm.
She went 1 year to OU and then was working in Oklahoma City. And I was still completing my work at Tech. Dad's sister, Dad was raised here in Guyman. One of his sisters was married to Ed Nash, so her name was Mary Nash, and he was the auto dealer here in Guyman.
Mm-hmm.
Had Nash Brothers Motor Company. Well, she had a Christmas family celebration that Christmas, and so naturally my aunt and my new aunt and my uncle and all the family were here, my folks. There was 5 together in Dad's family.
Mm-hmm.
He was the oldest, then 2 sisters, and then 2 brothers. And so we were at Mary's house. So Pat and I spent a lot of time visiting. In fact, it was interesting because that we were fairly well acquainted. Well, I don't know, we were just getting acquainted. But my Aunt Mary somehow made arrangements for Pat to have a date with a local fellow.
Uh-huh.
And so she got a date with his sister from me. And so we went to Catholic Mass that night. Well, when we came back to Aunt Mary's house, it was midnight or close.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Pat and I started visiting. We sat in the living room. At 6 a.m. the next morning, Aunt Mary got up to come in to put the turkey on, and Pat and I were still sitting there visiting. Her brother was in the Marines
Mm-hmm.
at that time, and so that was a common denominator there.
Mm-hmm.
We talked a lot about my brother, and I don't know, we just, Pat's so easy to visit with that we just enjoyed staying up all night visiting.
Yeah.
It was interesting.
So how long did you guys date before you got married?
Well, that was difficult because I was in Lubbock and she was still dating
Yeah.
in Oklahoma City, and I was dating in Lubbock. I was involved with fraternity activities and
Mm-hmm.
block and bridle, and a lot there in the ag school. My fraternity was very active. We had a lot of good activities. So, but when I started dating her, it was 383 miles from Lubbock to Oklahoma City. And thank goodness gasoline was fairly cheap back then, 25 cents a gallon or 28 cents. I put a lot of miles on my car running back and forth to Oklahoma City trying to keep her from dating somebody else.
So when did you 2 get married?
It was February the 1st in 1953.
And you said you moved her out to the ranch then?
Well, no, that was my last
Okay.
semester at Lubbock.
Okay.
So we were married in another aunt's house, Dad's sister, Bessie Ellison, there in Oklahoma City.
Okay.
And he was in the oil business, Uncle Kenneth in the oil business there. In fact, an interesting thing, he drilled a lot of those wells around the state capitol. The derrick that's still there south of the capitol that's still producing is the Ellison number 2. We were married in their home. They're not far from the capitol. Had a nice home. And poor Pat hadn't traveled to Texas much, so I had to take her. We went to the Fort Worth Fat Stock Show. Then went on to went to the Shamrock Hotel in Houston when it was the big event down there in Houston. And we didn't have very long off between semesters, and went back to San Antonio and took a boat ride there on the river. And bless her heart, I took her back to Lubbock, a little bitty apartment. And it was so small, I'll have to tell this, because the bed folded down from the wall.
Murphy bed.
And Pat always laughed about it, said she could sit on the commode and reach out and stir anything on the stove, you know, because the kitchen and the bathroom were just
It's
right there
so
so close
small.
together. But that was, that's part of early married life, I guess.
Yeah.
And I never will forget dirt storms in Lubbock, even in good years, because the cotton country down there in the sand, you can have some terrible dirt storms. And Pat had a time, naturally, transition for her. And I never will forget, one night it was awfully hot. We left the windows open there in the apartment. Woke up the next morning, there's sand all over the apartment.
That would drive me crazy.
So that's kind of like times up here. But we survived, and then I took her to the ranch, and it was June of 1953, right in the beginning of a terrible drought. And bless her heart, trying to keep house in the old ranch house that was not modernized. We had to have it wired for electricity after we went up there. One summer I had put the plumbing in the house, so we did have some plumbing. I had to change to a different well to have more water. But that was what we did most of the time, was just trying to modernize the house. And that was before we started having children. And Pat did a good job trying to clean and mop the old linoleum floors. So it was she stayed with it real well and stayed with me.
Yeah.
I joke about hiding the car keys so she wouldn't leave.
But she still
she was
stuck
just
it out.
she was such a trooper. She just
What was it like for a city girl to move to the country? Was that, I would imagine that was the difficult.
we had those Coleman lamps for lighting, and she said I still studied my books at night because I remember listening to the radio a lot. We had listened to Gunsmoke. Some of those old radio stories and everything, because we could get good radio reception. So we sat around the kitchen at night with a Coleman lantern and probably just drinking water and listening to those radio programs. And it was quite challenging for her, but my gosh, she did so well.
Yeah. And how about you? So you graduated and kind of were taking over ranching in the middle of the horrible drought. So what was that like?
Well, that was terrible because I wasn't able to have a herd yet, and that's why I spent most of my time in starting to remodel a house and modernize it and put in water systems. And we finally got it electrified, so we had electric lights. The old house had not had anything done to it in many, many, many years. It was just an old ranch house. It was the East House, my grandparents' house. It's in that picture. So then I started, I got a tractor and started working the field down in front of the house. My uncle still had the ranch leased and still had his herd there.
Okay.
So it naturally caused a little, I couldn't start running cattle yet. I was kind of in between land of trying to get ready to start doing something. And Dad wasn't going to force him off. We looked at a lot of ranches to try to find something to help him lease, where he could move his herd. And Dad, being his brother-in-law, just was very benevolent to him and tried to help him. And so I just had to kind of wait my time. Summer of 1955, Pat and I went to New Mexico with Uncle Hoss, and we found some cattle over there and bought some cattle over in New Mexico. It was part of, gosh, I wish I could remember the brand, Christmas Ranch, around Tucumcari. It was part of a dispersal from those, and they were very dark Herefords, good-looking cattle. My Uncle Hoss raised Richard Herefords, and so he knew a lot of locations, a lot of places to talk to try to find some cattle to buy. So that was when we started our herd in 55. Then in 55 we had a little bit of moisture and a little bit of grass. 56 was another terrible, terrible dry year. But we did go ahead and get, by that time my uncle found a ranch up in Colorado and moved his herd up there. So we bought some more cattle over in New Mexico, and they were more of a mellow yellow Herefords. And I never forget they had a TF brand on them, combined, And they're from the Tom Farmer Ranch over as another dispersal sale. And so we bought some more then to add, so we had the ranch stock then after that. 57, of course, began with the early blizzard we had at the end of March that was one of the old timers said he had endured an awful lot of blizzards, but he didn't remember one that snowed so much and lasted so long. But it was about 3 days, and of course you saw those pictures around Boise City, the terrible drifts. We had a lot of bare ground at that time but terrible drifts. How the wind currents would start piling snow up for some reason and continue building those big drifts. And some of the canyons had drifts that just you couldn't get around. Horseback was on the way to go anywhere, do anything. But the cattle, I had them on the river, and fortunately they bunched up and went into a little side pocket and had a lot of protection and a lot of cedar and survived the storm right there.
That's great.
It was a terrible event. Never forget, the county had left 2 road graders in a pasture just east of us. And another fellow and I went over there and got those road graders started and took them to the highway for them so they could start blading roads. There was a Trailways bus that had gotten stranded just north of the river bridge. And an elderly couple had a car behind them. And the people, and they couldn't travel because the road was blocked, and as far as they got, was just north of the river bridge. This older couple, the people from the bus went back and tried to get them to come into the bus and be with them. They said, no, we just sat here in the car, we're okay, the car's running, we'll just stay warm and tough it out right here. Well, the bus running, the carbon monoxide from the exhaust fumes, the car picked those fumes up, and the people,
Oh, wow.
yeah, people were dead. When Monday morning, when that storm broke, is a beautiful, bright, sunny morning, just beautiful. The storm started Thursday night. It blew hard Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. And but that was a tragic event.
Yeah, that was.
But I had an old Army half-track, and that I'd gotten to use pull a land plane down on that field that I was farming to try to raise some feed. And so we used it, and we could pretty well break through some of the drifts with it, and went around to one of the neighbors to see if they were okay. But we were able to open up some trails and get around with that old Army half-track.
When did you get involved with the Cattlemen's Association?
I'm sorry?
The Cattlemen's Association.
Pat and I were very active with farm groups. I've always been convinced that whatever profession you're in, you need to be involved with that profession, with the organization that helps support it. Pat and I both were quite active with Oklahoma Farm Bureau. I was county president. We served on a lot of committees. Pat did too. We were both very active with the Oklahoma Cattlemen's Association, and we helped quite a bit with when they had the beef check-off to fund it for promotion on beef, and we helped quite a bit with that campaign. I served as, I guess, one term on the Oklahoma Cattlemen's board. At the same time, Pat worked up as president of the Oklahoma Cattlewomen, and that was a very good experience for her. She really enjoyed it. She was quite active with the local cattle women's group, even down in the Texas Panhandle, Dalhart, Dumas. She would go to meetings down there, helping promote beef. And then when she was really active with the Oklahoma Cattle Women, she was state president and traveled all over the state, going to cook-offs.
That's good.
And when Oklahoma was still hosting the national cook-off contest, well, Pat's duty with her personality, the way she would greet people, well, it was her duty to go to the airport to pick up these contestants when they'd fly in from other states. And by the time they'd get to the hotel where the cook-off contest was being held, well, they felt like they were good friends and they were very welcome. And Pat just had a personality that she could visit with anybody and make them feel at home and feel welcome. Made a lot of friends that way. Her personality really benefited her position, and she enjoyed working with cattle women.
And it sounds like you two complement each other very well.
That was about the time that we were buying the dealership and coming to Guyman. So we got involved then, and there again, I was very strong on belonging to the Oklahoma Auto Dealers Association and served a term on the state board then. But I just started, and we belong to the National Auto Dealers Association. I just feel like you need to support whatever industry that you're involved in, because they are the ones that help you with legislative problems. And that was partly how I guess we got involved legislatively too. And just like later on, I was very active then with the Oklahoma NARO, which is Oklahoma Association of Royalty Owners, when I was involved with the royalty company that I served on the board, and I'm serving still on the board.
And what about the Conservation Commission?
That was interesting. Pat and I had helped David Bourne with his first campaign. We carried the broom. The broom was the clean sweep emblem that he used everywhere. When he came to Cimarron County, we hosted him out there. We took him to Kenton, and that was interesting. One time, riding in our Pontiac, coming from Black Mesa into Kenton, he was supposed to be at Boise City for a new meeting, and David Bourne liked to visit. He, good visitor. Well, we were late leaving out there. And so the highway patrolman behind me said, "You just go ahead and run it. You just go ahead. I'll be running." The only time I ever had a highway patrolman follow me at high speed and not stop me. So we got David Bourne into town in time. But when he had an unexpired term on the Oklahoma Conservation Commission, it's a 5-member commission that serves representing all of the state, the 5 different districts that they have. 5-year terms, and he had a fellow that was leaving to go to the Farmers Home Administration in Stillwater, and so he resigned his position. So David Bourne recognized my name as serving on the Conservation District. I joined the Conservation District in Cimarron County in 1966. So coming up next year, I guess I will get a 50-year pin.
Wow.
So that's long enough.
Wow.
It's been interesting. I've enjoyed my work with conservation very much.
Why is that important to you, the conservation aspects?
I have to admit that goes back to an early memory. I've always been very interested in protecting the environment and trying to improve it for the future. Just like I said, Jay's rotation out there with what's called mob grazing. You utilize the forage that's there at that time, then give it plenty of time to regenerate and regrow. And it's so much better. It's like the buffalo grazed. You know, they'd go through and just completely graze an area out, then maybe not come back for another year. And that has worked very well in ranching. Because particularly you have forbs, you have a lot of weeds that sometimes yearlings won't utilize, but a cow will, and they'll teach that calf what to eat. And so we raise our own calves for a future herd. I don't go out and buy cattle. I want to maintain the same basic genetics we've had for a long time. And that cow will teach that calf what to graze, where the trails are, and learn to ranch. And that's worked very well. With conservation, apparently David Bourne recognized my name as being a member. You have to be a member of a conservation, you have to be a conservation district director in one of the 88 conservation districts around the state. And so he recognized my name, and in fact when he had been out one time I made a comment about not enough representation from the panhandle downstate. And so that was his aide's comment to me. He said, "Well, you told David you need more representation from the panhandle." I gulped. I said, "Oh my goodness." You know how far it is from out here to the city? And he said, "But that's what you told David Bourne."
It's true.
He said, "Would you consider serving?"
And when was that?
It was a thrill. I really enjoyed serving on the commission. I was fortunate enough to serve 17 and a half years.
So when did you start serving on the commission?
That would have been, my goodness, 79.
Until when?
Late 78, 79. I served 17 years.
Okay. So you were telling us about how you got involved with the conservation.
Okay. I went on the local Cimarron County Conservation District Board in 1966. When I went to the ranch, one thing I was quite interested in was retaining all of the water I could that falls. I got an old RD7 Caterpillar dozer and built a lot of structures. Some of them were authorized and approved and engineered by the Soil Conservation Service, and many of them I just built plugs wherever I could, you know, in some of the gullies, and spreader dikes. We built a syrup pan system where the dam would kick the water out onto a 60-acre flat and had a series of 3 dikes there. and that was built according to soil conservation specs. So I had a lot of things. I felt like we need to hold that water back some way and let it soak in, and to not have so much sediment in the runoff. So two of my structures, I have 14-inch pipes in to drain back down. I catch the flash flood water and let it settle some and then drain out more slowly. And I built another big dike close to the house to hold water in a 50-acre field. And of course I paid to have all those done, but where I had my own tractor, I built a lot of my own little structures just wherever I wanted to put a plug, just trying to stop the erosion. Probably one reason I felt so strong about conservation efforts, taking range management, I wanted to try to protect the range. When we lived in San Angelo with the family, and it's what they call the Great Flood of 1936, and I remember it so vividly. Pat and I went back through San Angelo several years ago, and they happened to have that exhibit out. It was apparently a big event at the time, but when I was 4 years old, I think, born 32, and that was in 6. So I remember Dad took us all down to the river to watch. The Conchos River had 3 tributaries coming in that all converged there at San Angelo. That's why the Indians, Fort Concho was there, and it was the Indian settlements way before that, but it was a military settlement too at Fort Concho. But because of the drought and the runoff and a severe storm that came through, it was a severe flood. A lot of turbulence in the flood, a lot of sediment, and I remember seeing a house coming down the river and hit the concrete pillars of the road crossing the river, and it just shattered it. But those memories were so vivid at that flood, it bothered me. That, well, what can you do to help prevent those floods, like that? I guess it must have really impressed me. Then my Uncle Guy, that married Pat's mother, was quite a conservationist on his ranch. He worked with John Bailey, the Soil Conservation Service, in Major County, and built a lot of rangeland terraces, just like you would on a farm, but they were on his grassland, and built 3 large dams on his end of Glass Mountains. Glass Mountains there, you have so much red exposed Permian red beds. So he built some large structures to kind of fill in some of those exposed areas and just hold water back. Had a very nice duck hunting area there, and stocked his dams, for fishing. A club from Enid would come out and leased one of his structures in, just for recreational purposes. But the total conservation effort he was doing, I was impressed with. So when I went to the ranch, well, I guess that's, in fact, this Soil Conservation Service engineer, John Bailey, ended up in Texas County at the office here in Guyman. So I visited with him several times after he was at the ranch, so I was able to kind of continue that friendship. It just, that background, I think, just really interests me in conservation. And so with Oklahoma having so many of the upstream watershed structures, more than any other state, particularly what Red Males did with the Ouachita, with the upstream watershed structures there, to not completely control, but to really help control those massive floods they were having and the damage they had below them. And it's an impressive story for Oklahoma and what they've done with trying to control flooding and the water controls.
So what were some of your duties as a commissioner?
As commissioner? Of course, the commission itself handled the state budget appropriations back to the conservation districts.
Okay.
And continually we were trying to get additional funding. That's typical when you on any kind of agency.
Sure.
To get funding that you need for your people to do what they want to do. We've had a lot of conservation programs naturally across the state, but as a commission or state agency, the funding all came through the commission. So it was a legislative process a lot of times too, trying to came up, and one challenge right now, of course, well, the 319 water quality through the EPA was designated, the Conservation Commission was assigned that responsibility. And Oklahoma has one of the cleanest stream systems anywhere in the nation because they've tried to monitor where a lot of your pollutants were coming from. And that 319 water quality from the EPA being designated through the commission, I thought was quite a move to be able to. It gave us a little more on the ground activities through the state. Instead of being assigned to the water board, we got the responsibility. There's a lot of programs like that that the commission worked with.
So it looked like you have a very large region that you were kind of.
There's 18 conservation districts and went clear to Gary.
So did you visit all of those on a regular basis?
I tried when I could. I sure did.
You did.
And particularly when they would have. The Conservation Commission we always had area meetings, so I always attended our area meetings and took part in them. I very much enjoyed working with the people that were interested in conservation, from the state staff. Had a very dedicated office down there, had very good executive directors. The first one that I worked with was Leonard Solomon. They called him King Sol. Very smart legislative, very well acquainted with legislators and knew how to get things done. Was able to do a lot of things. And I met so many of the other people around the state and the other districts and the commissioners from other areas. It helped me learn more of the state and be acquainted all around. Later, then, the next executive director we had was Mason Mungle. I had met him in Washington, D.C. He was in the first Oklahoma Ag Leadership class, and I was in Washington, D.C. and at Clayton English's office, and met him, and we developed a friendship just right off. We seemed to mesh real well. And then he later was appointed on the commission from Atoka. So we served together on the commission. Then when Leonard Solomon resigned as executive director, he resigned from the commission to apply for that position. And I chaired the commission at that time, and we hired him. And he was a very good administrator, and was there for about almost a dozen years. But he had a very open policy that he liked to, whatever plans, whatever he was hoping to accomplish for the state, it was very much open table. He put it on the table, we discussed issues. It was a very good administrative approach and very good with his people. He had a large staff there and liked him very well.
So how did conservation kind of concerns change over the almost 18 years you were doing that? What were the main concerns when you started, and what were the kind of main concerns when you left?
The upstream watershed structures had already been built. So then it became a matter of maintenance. And that's still a big issue now, is getting funding, because those structures are over 50 years old. And so the maintenance problems, and sometimes we had problems sometimes with some areas where the beaver were very bad, and a lot of debris in the water, and it plugged up the drain tubes. And very seldom we had problems. We had a few structures that they had to rebuild that were fearful of being breached. The one thing we did was really made a strong move to go to conservation tillage, minimum till. That impressed me very much when I remember we had a field day at Enid, and the comparisons there where you had stubble left on the ground compared to bare tilled, and it was a very hot summer day, and had thermometers showing the difference in temperature and the soil temperatures between the clean tilled and the stubble tilled. And so we started the movement then of trying to go to what's called trash farming, which has taken a long time to implement, but that's been a very strong movement that is really beneficial now, where people are using ridge till and minimum till, even more of the residue, and that has helped so much before this last drought. help prevent another dust bowl. That's been very beneficial for this area and the state.
Yeah. What about issues or concerns with center pivot irrigation?
I'm sorry?
Issues or concerns changes with center pivot irrigation and water usage over time?
Yes. Again, with the different tillages, you could conserve water that way. Then we went to the LIPA system, which reduced low input precise application systems with the nozzles, regulators on the bottom of those drops. What we did in Cimarron County that was quite pleased about, we were able to get a torque sensor and irrigation monitoring where we could go out there, our technician could go out there and measure drawdown in a well, what the pump, they had a flow meter to measure the flow, then a torque sensor to see how much horsepower it's taken to produce that amount of water and measure the fuel flow coming in. So they could give the farmers a good readout on how efficient their pumping system was. Probably if their bowls were nearly worn out, they needed to go to the bank and borrow money to rebuild their pump system or rebuild their engine, whatever. They had some basic information they could use then to go ahead and go to their banker. So we did a lot of monitoring that way for the farmers out there. And that was in Cimarron County. Also, I was able to get through the commission, I was able to get a John Deere Maximerge, which that was interesting because everything is planted on 40-inch rows. Milo, everything, the furrows are 40-inch spacing. Well, it was so hard to get people to switch back to a 30-inch narrow row spacing, have the same plant population, but you got more ground cover a lot quicker. You don't have any exposed ground. And everybody said, well, my equipment's for 40 inches. The reason it's 40 inches because that's what the mules walked. And it was so difficult. And now people are going down to much narrower than that. But we had that John Deere Maximerge that we would let producers use to plant their crops, particularly Milo and a lot of the sandy country in Cimarron County. I got it through the commission.
And when was that?
Oh gosh, I don't know what year.
Decade?
Had to be in the mid-'80s, I suspect. I don't remember the year. We had oil overcharge funds available to us, a pretty good amount of money. So we were able to buy some equipment for people to use. And I had to argue for that, but we finally got that John Deere bought for the Panhandle. They had it designated for all 3 counties, but it ended up being used mostly in Cimarron County because that's where we were really kind of promoting it. Also, I was quite concerned about water quality, groundwater. Because so many abandoned farm sites around the country, abandoned irrigation wells. So about 1990, I think it was, 89 or 90, I really started pushing real hard for water testing. And eventually we do a lot of well decommissioning now through the commission. And I really pushed that because it's where they can go in there and completely seal off that old well tube, whether it's an irrigation well or a stock well or whatever, but that way to keep contamination from going down that into our water aquifer. I wanted the college down here to do the water testing. I thought it would be an opportunity for them, for their students. And the chemist there, for some reason, he was afraid of the liability if they started doing water testing. And what I was thinking, I even got funding for him through the commission to put in a water testing lab at Goodwill. But Dr. Gardner wouldn't do it. And again, I think it was his fear, but I thought it would be a training opportunity for the students to learn more about water testing and for their future. Garden City has a good water testing lab. But so many times we send water to Oklahoma City, take samples down, it was too aged by the time we would pull it out here and drive clear to Oklahoma City to get it tested.
Wow.
So it was hard to get a good water test. So I pushed that. I was very interested in being able to test our groundwater that we drink, just because there's so many old abandoned wells around. So then we went ahead, since we didn't get it done at Goodwill, we put in our own water testing lab at the Conservation District office there in Boise City.
Okay.
And it's been used a lot. And there again, it's not an official guaranteed test, but it gives people an idea if they need to have further testing done.
Sure.
It gives you a monitoring.
Sure.
So you can go in there, and it's amazing how many household wells are right by the stock pens, because that's where the windmill was. They
Yeah.
water cattle, and you run water to the house.
Yeah.
And we found a lot of problems,
Sure.
too many nitrates, and so that's helped a lot of people. That was something we really did.
So how has ranching changed in your lifetime?
When Jay went to the ranch, when Pat and I bought the dealership and came to Guyman, that was a very good move for the Clark family.
Mm-hmm.
Pat's personality, she enjoyed being with people.
Mm-hmm.
When all three children had left home, she had a very strong empty nest problem. She didn't help me that much outside on the ranch,
Mm-hmm.
but she went into Boise City and substitute taught. Everybody they really wanted her to substitute for them because she made the kids mind. She just had a way with handling people
Mm-hmm.
that they all wanted her to be their sub. And Pat just needed to be with people. So she worked part-time in town and substitute taught
Mm-hmm.
and helped at a local shoe store for a while. So it worked out well for us to come to Guyman, for her to be involved.
Mm-hmm.
And that worked out so well for the family. For Jay had just married Marlene, and so they were able to move to the ranch and have their. Jaylene was born here in Guyman before they went to the ranch, but they
Mhm.
moved in, bought a double wide home, and moved to the ranch, and it worked out so well for them to be there to raise his family there at the
Mhm.
ranch. Jay did a lot of things at the ranch that I've always supported. We talked every day. He was my best friend. But he divided the ranch into I had several pastures, quite a few pastures, and I did probably a type of rotation with what I had,
Mm-hmm.
because when I went to the ranch, it had been run down, and I had to do an awful lot of fencing to rebuild the ranch. And like I said, I built a lot more water facilities and ponds, developed more water. So he started cross fencing with a lot of dividing pastures into 4 pastures.
Wow.
So we had more paddocks. So we had a real intensive rotation, and even in our shortgrass buffalo country out there, it still worked well,
Mm-hmm.
because like I said, that the cattle will eat the forbs, and cows are really the only bovine that really works well in Surround County, in that
Mhm.
rough country. We've tried yearlings. A lot of my neighbors have tried yearlings, and usually after 2 or 3 years of running yearlings, they're hunting a cow herd, because with a cow herd you have to leave safe back winter grass.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to, in your rotation, you have to designate which pastures will be your winter forage.
Mm-hmm.
Graze it early, let it regrow for your winter pasture. We've done a lot, probably a lot of improvements in cattle genetics. In fact, Jay got me started, got acquainted with Kit Pharaoh Cattle Company, and that's where I just bought 3 bulls this past week, and I was talking to Charlie about we'll go pick up.
Mm-hmm.
They are not grain fed, they're grass fed. You can take one of the Pharaoh bulls and turn them out to go to work, and they don't lose weight.
Mm-hmm.
They just are more native to the natural environment, and are very they'll maintain weight and actually gain a little weight and take care of the summer work.
Mm-hmm.
Very good disposition bulls. It's interesting the way they select them for disposition. They give them a 5-star rating, but they'll put a bull in an alley by himself, and 2 individuals will start walking towards him, and they grade him according to when that bull starts showing nervousness. And if he's gentle and they can get pretty close to him, well, they give him a 4 or 5-star rating. So they grade the bulls on fleshing ability, on calving ease for heifers, a 5-star calving ease, and we just don't seldom have to pull a calf anymore, even with our heifers, and that has helped us a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing Jay did that I had reluctance to was to calve in sync with nature. You never think about it, But all of our neighbors out there, I have some neighbors that will calve in January or February. And I usually start calving in March. Well, we'd have some March storms, April storms. You'd have to feed extra for the cows. You'd lose some calves.
Yeah.
You'd pull the cows down before you had grass in May and June. So Jay would calve now, late. And I had a hard time with that because the calves would be so late in the fall. But it's in sync with nature, and it reduces the feed that you have to feed that cow before she calves. She's ready to start producing milk when you have grass this time of year and when the calf's just starting to grow. And because when you think about it, the deer, when they fawn, horses naturally, they don't foal till late in the season. It's just nature.
Yeah.
And Jay was very adaptive to changing our ranch to that kind of a procedure, and it's quite interesting and we talked about it a lot, but it's more of a holistic type of ranching.
Are there things you've learned from past droughts that helped you through this last drought?
You have to have plenty of water. We've developed some springs. A lot of our springs are drying up because of the competition with woody species. Our biggest challenge, I think, in our area and the Cimarron is the water consumption by the trees and tamarack. That has got to be a huge problem all over the state, really all over the state. That picture I showed you on the back of that book about the ranch, there were no trees in it. This country would burn out. I mean, there wasn't any way for man to control fire. Whether the Indians started the fire or whether they were lightning strikes. I've talked this issue a lot because I know one of the early reports was one of the early recorded fires started down by Amarillo on the Canadian River, and it burned through to the Canadian border in 6 weeks.
Wow.
So that had to have covered thousands of acres. But we didn't have the woody species. You had, and that's what the Indians did for their buffalo pastures. They would deliberately set a fire to burn an area, so the buffalo would come to that fresh grass. So that's a good, fire is a good tool, and as you're familiar with, down around Stillwater, and controlled burning. That's another thing the commission did, was to have a lot of schools on controlled burning, and have people trained to know when to start a fire and when are the best time was and how to control them. So that's a good ranching tool. It's hard to use in our country because we don't have enough forage on the ground.
It's so dry.
But too much of the state has too much woody species competition.
So that's one of the things you noticed in your kind of lifetime that's changed, is there's more woody
The invasion of the woody species out there is very severe for us. The tamarack on the river and more trees on. The competition with water on cottonwoods has been, people have known that for a long time. Dad told me that back during the 30s, when Oklahoma City was short of water because of the drought, somebody from OU, I think it was, advocated killing all the cottonwood trees coming up the North Canadian.
Wow.
To improve the water flow into Oklahoma City.
Wow.
Then they completed Lake Canton after that. Of course, that took care of the water supplies. But so that's been a known factor for a long time. In fact, I've always heard that, or been told that a 30-inch diameter cottonwood tree will take 1.5 foot of water a year. I mean, you could raise an acre of corn for what that one tree is taking.
That's amazing.
When people worry about using water for irrigation, that's a very wasteful use of it on these cottonwoods. I like trees. I'm not trying to say we need to eliminate trees, but and another example of that, I mentioned the flood on the Conchals when I was very young. One of the range specialists that we hired for Stillwater, gosh, what was his name? He went to Texas and worked in conservation there, and gave I went to a range meeting a number of years ago, and he was one of the presenters. And his presentation at that time was removing woody species in one of the tributaries on the Conchals. He said they actually brought it back to live water. Removing the woody species, there was more grass cover to allow the percolation into the soil to bring back your natural flow in the creek. And that's what needs to be done in Texas too, for people to have water in the towns and communities. It's going to be an expensive process and hard to implement.
Sure.
But woody species are one of our big problems for water.
My last question is, what is your advice for the next generation of ranchers?
I'm sorry?
My last question is, what is your advice for the next generation of ranchers?
Oh gosh. I've got some very smart grandsons and a very smart granddaughter. And I know the ranching background for them gives them a strong desire. In fact, that's what we have done on our ranch, is create the ZH Ranch LP as a way, hopefully, to continue their interest and control of our ranch. We're having a ranch get-together the end of this month. I hope I'm don't interfere by getting this need done at the wrong time, where I plan to be there. And it's going to be interesting to have the family there and have a nice picnic and a ranch reunion. But we have gone through this process of organizing a LP ranch, ZH Ranch Corporation, and then the Ranch LP Limited Partnership under that. All 6 grandkids will be limited partners in the operation. So I know that's their interest, and there's so many times you see families have to divide property, and that's a difficult thing. Our ranch isn't really that large an operation, but it's something that they all really care about. And I think the combined ownership that way through the limited partnership, I hope will be something lasting for them.
So what's your advice for them as they start out?
My advice to them? To enjoy the ranch. Make the most of it. It's a heritage that our family, fortunately, has been able to maintain. Our big challenge is what to do with the school land. Someday, I hope we could get an administration that would let us buy it. That's what needs to be done. I have fought that so hard for years that it needs to be on local tax rolls. I have never really agreed with the government, state or federal, owning property that should be in private ownership. That's where you grow the country. It just never grows when the government controls things. And old abandoned air bases should be sold property. The government owns a lot of property, like I mentioned earlier about eastern Colorado. Those lands need to be back in private ownership. And particularly these in Oklahoma, in our area, because we have that intermingled deeded land in those tracts. And that's such an imposition for anybody to even come out here and try to bid on it. To have to fence me out if they took the school land away from me. It needs to be in private ownership, and particularly where we've already established ownership there in the canyons. It's a real challenge, and I hope someday that we get that resolved.
I hope so.
I've tried hard.
and then hopefully I think the next generation will try also. Well, I really enjoyed talking to you, so thank you for your time.